I'm Thomas Hudson, banner number B00371972, and this is my pitch for my TV show 1965. So, the premise for the series is an alternate history 1960s Britain where there's an increase in social disparity between the different classes, and the country finds itself on the brink of civil war amongst all the various pieces of unrest. At the heart of the story, we have an estranged father and son who have to reconcile the differences in order to try and save the town and the people they care about from succumbing to complete chaos and all-out civil war. So Danny Forger is the primary protagonist of the show, and he's a young soldier who's estranged from his father and now finds himself back in the town that he fled when he was younger. Only this time he's there as part of a paramilitary peacekeeping force and is facing off against the people he once called family and friends. This gives him a kind of complex where he feels this kind of stretching loyalty between his duty as a soldier and the sentimentality of his former people and family. His estranged relationship with his father is very much a cause of him being very much like his father. They're both stubborn and pig-headed, and because of that, they butt heads constantly when he was younger. Now, because of this, though, he's also very much his mother's son, in that he's very neurotic and he's very caring about the people in his life, but he goes about it in such a stubborn way that he thinks the world's black and white and there's a specific and certain way to do things, a kind of naivety that's abused by the people around him and often leads to him acting in ways that aren't malicious, but the ignorance of it gets people hurt, and he's trying to navigate that at the same time, trying to reconcile with his father as they both butt heads and are put in this conflict where they're essentially determining the fate of the rest of England. So John Forger is Danny Forger's estranged father. He's a miner and a former veteran of World War II, which left him with very deep-seated emotional scarring and psychological scarring. So when Danny was younger, he was very much absent from the life as he was much more focused on his kind of political ideals and ideology and trying to make the world a better place in the way he saw fit. But in doing so, he kind of pushed his family away, specifically Danny, as Danny took issue with the way that he saw the world and took issue with his father's kind of rigid, stone-cold masculinity. And even though John's very abrasive in how he comes across, he's very much rooted in trying to make the world a better place for the majority rather than for the minority. And although he's not opposed to violence, as he's seen his share of it, he'd rather avoid it, given he's very much aware of the kind of horror that violence brings with it, specifically war. Yet despite this, he's not against using violent means to achieve his goals. But this, all in all, makes him a kind of a wheelhouse of a character where he's got this constant conflict at play between himself and his son as he sees his worst version of himself within his son. And at the same time, he's got this conflict within himself of trying to do the right thing, even though it might conflict with his ideals and principles. So Ellen is Danny's sister and John's daughter, and from a young age she's very much been the emotional core of their relationship, as she often had to act as the third party between the two when they came into conflict. And even though it's years since, she still finds herself in this role, not even just within her own family life, but within Skolton society as a whole, where she's very much always been the diplomat and mediator between people. And now that Danny's come back into their lives, but on the opposite side of what they deem like the ideological fence, she's once again having to reprise that role of being the emotional bond between the two and keeping the peace. She's always been very close to Danny and guides him emotionally in terms of doing the right thing, and she also keeps an emotional check on her father to keep his temper in line. And as well as this, she's also married to Stanley Ashworth, a radical socialist, and between all that, she's the only one that really keeps tabs on an emotional lid on the whole family dynamic, especially the mother, who is very much left out of the picture and has become increasingly neurotic with age. So Ellen finds herself constantly bouncing between everyone, trying to be the anchor, but at the same time longing for much more than she knows she'll ever have. And she's kind of resigned herself to this role, but come to terms with it and accepts it as a necessary part of her role in life. So, in terms of other characters in the show, one of the major ones is Major Jack Clements, who's Danny's commanding officer and is a former brother-in-arms of his dad, John Forger, as they both served in World War II together. Following Danny's fleeing of the town from at a young age, he was taken in by Jack Clements and trained to be a soldier under his command. And he very much acts as like the surrogate father figure that Danny never had growing up. And as such, when Jack later dies in the series, you really feel this, hole left, both between Danny and John, as they respectively lost a very close friend to themselves. The overarching antagonist of the series is Professor Nigel Hornsby. He's been tasked by this section of MI5 with orchestrating all this unrest and working with a subsection of the IRA in order to fulfill various political goals and achievements for the people that they're employed by. And then the constant thorn in everyone's side is Stanley Ashworth, who's John's son-in-law and Danny's brother-in-law, married to Ellen. And he's works for the same organisation that John does, but he's like young, hot-headed and very radical in his beliefs of socialism, and he believes that the only way to really achieve a proper voice for the common man is through violent action. So the entire show takes place in the fictional town of Skolton, which is like a quintessential Lancashire town, like a mining town with common working people, with very little upper class kind of wealth, and most people are not in poverty, but given the current economic circumstances of the story world, they are very much straddling that poverty line, especially given the constant pressure put on them by the government. And Skolton acts as a microcosm for the rest of the story world in a grander sense, as it's not the only town under this kind of pressure from the government and this kind of ever-growing class disparity that's engaged the whole nation. So to this end, it kind of acts as a representative character in its own right to what the rest of the story world looks like, and is a stage for this ever-growing conflict to spiral out of, which it inevitably does at the end of the season. So Danny is the primary protagonist of the TV show, and over the course of the season we'll see him develop as a character and come to terms with the person he is, and have to try and kind of reconcile with the person he used to be and his issues with his father. We'll see him kind of come into conflict between his duty as a soldier and the loyalties he has to both his family and the people of Skolton as a whole. And we'll see him kind of bounce around between various factions and be put to the test, and then eventually have to take agency on himself to try and stop civil war from completely cascading the country, and doing what he deems necessary as a man to prevent that from actually happening. On the flip side of Danny's character arc, we'll also have the perspective of John, as the actions of these covert forces are ongoing. We'll see how John has to then react, much how like Danny's having to react to the situation. But from his end of the conflict between the two, whereas Danny works for the soldiers and the RSR, the paramilitary division that's been deployed to keep the peace in Skolton, John's a leading figure of a socialist movement who's kind of tasked with having to keep the peace, not just in Skolton and between them and the soldiers, but he's also having to try and fight off various internal conflicts of his organisation, more specifically from like the younger, more radical, hot-headed elements of it who want violent action, like the main proponent of that being his son-in-law, Stanley Ashworth. And throughout this season, we'll see him also have to come to terms with the kind of man that he really is, and have to kind of shed a hard-boiled masculinity in order to, protect the people he cares about and eventually reconcile with his son, as well as have to step up and take the fight directly to the people and make a stand for his ideals, full stop, without any more pussyfooting around. So the kind of episode-by-episode structure will primarily revolve around these covert kind of forces like MI5 and the IRA working together to try and sow seeds of chaos amongst like the two main conflicting factions. And we'll see, like, as the episodes progress, the escalation and the various actions of these actors as they play out the conflict they want to burst. And so that will kind of act as a narrative driving force episode by episode, and it will give the two main characters in their primary arcs the main things to react to, at least in the first half of the season. Then after that kind of point of no return where the main characters take the brink of agency and Major Clements is executed, these elements will kind of fade more into the background, but still operate in keeping the pressure on the main characters as they're driven to the end game of the show, where Danny and John will be put in like direct conflict with each other to determine like the fate of the rest of the UK and whether or not civil war will end up actually breaking out. So in terms of potential audience, it would be mostly targeted at like a prime time British audience, given the show's British, the cast's British, and it's altogether a very British show revolving around predominantly British issues. More specifically than that, it would be kind of targeted towards people who are engaged in like the current political discourse, because although it's a period piece, the content and the themes and the discussion of the show is still very much relevant today. I mean, and especially the genre of alternate history. I mean, we can see that with examples like The Man in the High Castle being a big success for Amazon. And then just in terms of other period pieces broadcast on the BBC, we can see that shows like Peaky Blinders garner an interest from people purely on maybe an aesthetic or entertainment basis. And even though it won't be as flashy or as aesthetically pronounced as something like Peaky Blinders, there would still very much be that element of inherent masculinity and violence that takes precedent throughout the entire show, as it is very much a masculine piece, trying to portray masculinity, as negative and as positive as it could be interpreted, but also having elements of femininity laced in, specifically with the character of Ellen. She acts as the emotional core of it and keeps all this kind of masculinity tethered and bound. And we see how that kind of like femininity is necessary for masculinity to exist. So all these elements should bring in a pretty diverse audience, but specifically a British audience. So in terms of potential broadcasters, I've decided to go with the BBC, primarily because it's a British show, and I think there's an underrepresentation of northern culture in British television, especially in period pieces, as most of that kind of television is southern centric, more specifically London centric. So I believe in kind of giving a representation not just to like a working class kind of character base, but also a specifically northern one, at the same time having elements of different classes coming into conflict with each other and having these different cultures from across England all merging together, and even some parts of Northern Ireland, and seeing how they all blend together in this kind of melting pot in a fictionalized version of 1960s Britain. And as well as this, I'd like to explore mental illness, which more often than not it's physical disability that we see in television, but less so mental disability, with many of these characters being soldiers and veterans of various conflicts. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation. Nothing much more to add than that, really.